Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 19th chapter of Job. We're going to cover the first 12 verses. This is Job's sixth speech, and this is in response to Bildad the Shuhite's second speech. We're on round 2 of the exchange of monologues in the debate and argument, which forms the main portion of the book of Job. It consists of 4 and eventually 5 human beings struggling to make sense of the justice of the Almighty in reference to Job, and this work of literature falls into the category of theodicy, which explores and explains the relationship of suffering to why the righteous suffer. And Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamanite, they are their own men. They own men with their own minds. They're certainly capable of producing an original thought. They have their own words, but they all argue, they all defend the same theological orthodoxy, which insists that suffering is deserved in response to sin. And so there's this reflection that the earthly economy and justice is reflective of the heavens. Job's experience so clearly invalidates the premise of that suggestion. So Job is stubbornly maintaining his innocence, and it is a contest between an immovable object and an irresistible force. It's 3-on-1, and they have they take it personally that Job is not benefiting from their wisdom, which are really out of place words. They're the wrong words for the wrong person at the wrong time. They offer no words of hope, comfort, or healing, or they do not add any insight to his experience. So the tone is a little more personal in the second round than it is in the first. When we read that Bildad the Shuhite, who we earlier heard from in the 8th chapter, opens with much the same thing. He says, "When do you put an end to words? Understand and let us talk." He opens it in the 8th verse. He's saying Job is long-winded. He's saying a lot, but he's not really saying much at all. His words, he's chattering, but he's not saying anything of substance. And Job says the same thing in the 3rd verse of the 16th chapter. Is there an end to words of wind? Long-winded speeches. They're talking, but they're not making substantive arguments that are registering with their respective counterparts. And he's inviting him to listen, and then we can talk. When you stop talking, you have to listen and understand by listening. Why should we be reckoned as beasts, as stupid in your eyes? So he takes Job's shots and insults and barbs at him as personal affronts. He feels that he is debasing them to he's speaking to them as though they were stupid when they are wise, and they kind of are entitled, they're self-entitled to the respect that their wisdom, their reputation for wisdom affords them. The light shall be dark in his tent, and his lamp shall be put out. This is his observation of the ways of the wicked. The wages of wickedness is not an investment with dividends worth attaining, and this is directed at Job. He describes in words Job's experience. As we get into it, he is set into a net by his own feet, and he walks on a pitfall. So the way of the wickedness is self-destructive. They eventually lay traps, springs, and deceptions that they themselves fall and succumb to. He uses hunting analogy in the next 2 verses 9 and 10. Net, snare, noose, trap, all these are hunting devices which the wicked ensnare themselves with analogously. And the consequence is that they're just governed by irrational fear. Fear is their default state of mind. Alarm, they hear alarms all around them. The leaf blowing in the wind is sufficient to send them into a frenzy. We read of in Leviticus 26. It devours part of his skin. The firstborn of death devours his part. This was a sensitive subject for Job because he's speaking directly at Job. That he's saying it devours the parts of your skin. Job had skin boils, and they insisted that it was because he was a terrible secret sinner whose reputation and honor was a facade and a mirage, and he wasn't worthy of the respect that was allotted him. And the sickness, he was at death's door, he expresses many times in his own words. Remembrance of him perishes from the earth, and he has no name on the street. To the ancients, the preservation of one's legacy and memory would have been paramount. They had a quest. Now, humankind is geared with a quest for immortality, and one of the ways we live that out is by procreating, to create versions of ourselves to perpetuate life. And another way we do it is, as Christians, is that we cultivate eternity. We have a longing for immortality, and the ancients, is considered a sign of God's blessing that you had plenty of progeny and plenty of offspring and descendants. Verse 19, he leaves no offspring or descendants among his people, nor any survivor in his dwellings. Job had lost all 10 of his children. The physical structure and the barn that they gathered to socialize and gather at had crushed on them all at once. And so Job had no offspring. He was a man with health, wealth, respect, prestige, honor, and acclaim, and he suddenly lost it all. It had instantly evaporated in a twinkle of an eye, and he lost his children. Just imagine losing one child, and then imagine losing 10 of them, your entire life's work. And so this would have been a sensitive subject to address Job, certainly in that light. Indeed, such are the dwellings of the perverse, and this is the place of him who does not know El. Ignorance from El is the root of sin, so if we do not cultivate a knowledge or an awareness of divinity, we will be foolishly and inextricably inclined towards sin. So Job had no one to blame but himself is the substance of his argument. That is his answer of making sense of Job's suffering. Job is not satisfied, so he's going to fight it tooth and nail. And that's what we read in the 19th chapter, first verse. This is Job's 6th speech. And Job answered and said, how long would you grieve my life and crush me with words? Job's life was grieved in a very literal way. He had it all and he lost it all. He been rewarded in proportion to his righteousness. He had always done the right thing. He was upright. He was honest. He had flourished because of his reputation for honesty in business. And so he was certainly rewarded in his life for his righteousness. And then Satan comes into the heavenly throne room in Yahweh points with pride and delight to Job, and then Satan accuses him of having a commercial conception of worship. He was only righteous in as much as he was rewarded to. If you took around the hedge of protection, he said he will curse you to his face, and he says, all right, you just can't harm Job. You can, he takes his health, his wealth and his family in the first chapter, and then Satan ups the ante and says, all right, well, he's still healthy, let me take that away from him. And so he had been grieved ever since as a result of the skin boils which were inflicted on him. The symptoms of his pain and condition are outlined. He had terrible breath, we read in this chapter. He was emaciated and skinny, we've read in the 17th chapter, and he was covered head to toe with skin boils. And so he had every right and reason to be grieved. On top of that, he was prospering and was doing it the right way and doing the right thing and, seemingly being rewarded for it. He had never done any man wrong. And then suddenly a supernatural force comes. And to add insult to injury, his friends, the three ones with whom he would have had equal standing, Job was the greatest man in the East, it is written in the first chapter. But they are fair weather friends. They seemingly desert him in his agony and dilemma. And so they're described as comforters, but he is, in Job's words, they are miserable comforters, he says earlier. These 10 times you have insulted me. Shamelessly you attack me. 10 is a round number. It is not a literal number. Now, Eliphaz's first speech is the 4th and 5th chapters, and then Bildad and Zophar's are one chapter each. Then Eliphaz speaks in the 15th chapter, and now Bildad speaks in the 18th, and then Zophar speaks in the 20th. So there's not even that many speeches, but he's just rounding it to say an indefinite number of the number 10 was not thought of or as approached by the ancient Hebrews quite the same way that we look at it. But he feels insulted. He's taking it personal, and now he's already injured. So to add insult to injury would be a shameless thing to do. Yet they are a shameful thing to do. Yet they are shameless of it, and they attack them. And have they no shame? Can they not see in the mirror? Take a few steps back and really look at yourself. Here is a man whose suffering is beyond reckoning or imagining or anything we can relate to. And do you come to him with baseless accusations of some wrongdoing on his behalf? Or do you offer them? So words are weapons and they are tools. Just like a tool, you can use a hammer to build a foundation or a building, or you can use it to bash someone over the head with. Our words are the same way, and these words did sting. And, words do affect people profoundly, and there is a power in life and vitality and substance to them that is often unreckoned. Even if I have truly gone astray, my straying remains with me. So he's saying he might, he didn't claim to be sinless, but he was described as blameless or perfect, depending on the translation. That just means he has unimpeachable integrity. It doesn't mean he never makes a mistake, doesn't mean he ever sins. But Job is open to the possibility that he had sinned in secret, or in some way that he had sinned and Yahweh was speaking to him, but he couldn't understand the extremity of the severity with which he was speaking to him through his pain. And pain is a valid form of revelation. Yahweh also often uses it to instruct us and to mold us and to refine us into better versions of ourselves. Pain and suffering, whether sought or unsought, is the path to wisdom. Everything I've learned about my life, myself, and my God has come through pain and suffering, whether sought or unsought. And in prosperity and pleasure, I don't really learn a whole lot, if anything at all. Know then, if indeed you would exalt yourself above me and plead against me my reproach. So he's accusing his opponents. He's speaking to them collectively. That this is probably a plural you. He feels surrounded, so he's aware that he is overwhelmed numerically right now. So he is addressing the you. It's not capitalized, it's lowercase. That means his human counterparts are exalting themselves, and they are arrogating themselves to a superior station and status than them. They think they are wiser, that they are righteous because they are prosperous. They know something that Job doesn't, because look at him now. And they're not treating him as a friend or equal. He's heard everything they have to say. He was, conditioned to believe much the same thing, but his present experience invalidates the premise of the suggestion that all suffering is in equal and perfect proportion to the sin that we commit. There's too many complexities which result from the overlap and interchange of moral agency to blame the sovereignty of the Almighty, and he is not obligated to intervene as we exercise our agency in the course of human history. He only does so to wind it to his ultimate purpose. But pleading against him my reproach, he knew that he was down, he knew that he was out, he was dejected, despised, in pain and suffering, and just had nothing to brag about in his present situation. And his life was flourishing, recently, but then all of a sudden it all came down. And why would they plead against that? Why would they use that against him as evidence, which they have no evidence that he was a sinner, or at least was a great sinner in proportion to the calamity which was afflicted with him? Know then that Elohah has overthrown me, and he has surrounded me with his net. Elohah is the singular version of Elohim, which is plural. Elohim is a team. They are Father, Son, and Spirit. That word is frequently or universally translated as God in and pretty much every Bible, but the distinction between the singular and plural is not captured in the English as it is in the Hebrew. So this translation, my translation of preference, the Hallelujah Scriptures, retains a lot of the authentic and original Hebrew terms. And in a lot of ways, the Hebrew language, in more ways than we have time to elaborate on right now, the Hebrew language is often a richer language than the... But to return to the passage itself and what Job is trying to say, is that he feels that he is being treated by Eloah as an enemy. That's what enemies do to other people. They overthrow them and surround him with his net. So he has a personal vendetta against Job, and Job cannot understand it because he was always a friend, a loyal servant, an ally, and worshiper of Eloah, but he was treating him like an enemy, and he didn't even deign to explain to him the reason why. See, I cry violence, but I am not heard. I cry aloud, but there is no justice. Job is longing for justice. It is his most pressing present need. He demands his day in court in heaven to be vindicated, that though he had been visited and attacked mightily by some supernatural power, unbeknownst to him or any of his three friends, it was Satan. Their vocabulary does not reflect a knowledge or an awareness of Satan, but he's more to the point of the passage. He feels bereft of justice, and it is all excessively concentrated. The workings of the supernatural and all of their worldviews are excessively concentrated on Yahweh, whose sovereign supremacy permits Satan to work his wiles and wonders, and he was tempting Job at his permission. This was a test. So Yahweh doesn't test us, but Satan sometimes, that is his exclusive ministry. So if you're tempted to do wrong, that's the devil tempting you. And but in spite of this lack of justice, he had honored his end of Yahweh's investment in the wager that Job would not blaspheme him or forsake him. But he still feels that he's in justice, and when Yahweh condescends in the form of the whirlwind to answer Job and to accommodate his request for an audience with him, he argues from the vantage point that might is right if Job has no insight as to where was he when the foundation of the earth was laid, then he has no valid input or insight into how the sovereign one governs his universe morally. He has fenced up my ways, and I do not pass over, and he has placed darkness in my paths. So the he is Yahweh, that's the one he's attributing personal blame for his misfortunes in life. He feels that there's a supernatural force, and he is correct, but he is incorrect to identify that force and that calamity, and the sickness was not an expression of Yahweh's wrath, but of Satan's just natural desire to reduce us to misery. Misery enjoys company. That's why Satan does what he does. He knows his hour is short and his time is doomed, but his goal is to take as many people down there with him, because he wants us to be deprived of what he lost, because he was an angel in heaven and he was good, and then he decided to be bad. But we are equally culpable. We too have the same agency as the agents, and if we follow it his ways and our own ways, then we will follow him down to that dreaded destiny, which is darkness. He has stripped me of my esteem and taken the crown from my head. Job was not exactly a king, but he was the leading citizen of Uz. This was a town in Edomite territory, and his prestige, his reputation is renowned. He had administered justice and conducted commerce at the city gate. He was a known figure, well respected, well revered. He had a reputation for honesty, and suddenly his influence winnows because he no longer has the wealth, the health, the family. He has nothing in this life going for him, and because of that tragic reality, he is stripped of. He has no place and standing in society. He is abandoned by the society that he had helped so much. There is not a poor person he would not administer justice to. But now, where was society? He who had devoted himself to society's well-being and upkeeping was abandoned by society and forsaken by Yahweh, or El Shaddai, as he would have called him in all occasions but one. He breaks me down on every side, and I am gone, and uproots my hope like a tree. Earlier, Job spoke more positively of a tree as a signal of hope, a hope for life, but when that is uprooted, when a tree is cut down to the stem and it is still a stump, then the potentiality for rejuvenation and to continue to survive as a tree is always there. It is when it is uprooted that's when the life of the tree or the organism ceases to exist, because apart from the roots, it has no access to the soil and the nutrients that it needs to sustain therein. So Job uses the tree analogy negatively. He earlier envies the tree, and now he compares himself to one who had hope and had a promise and a promising future and hopeful expectation. He eventually does express a faith in the resurrection which awaits us in the material after the material we've covered today. And he kindled his wrath against me, and he counts me as one of his enemies. So once more, he cannot understand why a supernatural force would be orchestrated so extremely and severely in the negative direction towards himself. And the only plausible explanation was that Yahweh had reckoned him as an enemy, and Yahweh had a wager in the bet that Job would not forsake him, even if it seemed that he would be forsaken by him. But Job is incorrect to assume that the sovereign one is automatically responsible for all the evil in the world, even the unmerited evil. Evil is, in some sense, a retribution and a karmic boomerang, but it is also, much evil is unmerited. It starts somewhere, and all these conflicts spring from a single act of evil. But the theme of theodicy explores the relationship of suffering into the righteous, and why did Job suffer so severely? And it was because he was so righteous. He existed as a test to prove to Satan and to posterity that even though you can lose everything, there are two things you cannot lose. The two things that Satan could not take from Job was his faith and his integrity, and he did not succumb to his temptation. His desired design was to compel Job to blaspheme him, and this he would not do. His companies come together, and they cast up their way against me, and encamp all around my tent. So he feels surrounded by a plurality of an angel of army. This is probably Yahweh. I forget. It's in Exodus 1. Yahweh of hosts, that is his military name. He is the commander of legions of angels, sword-carrying angels, riding on horses that wage war in heaven against the satanic forces aligned against him. But he feels that on earth he has a special vendetta against Job, who is surrounded and besieged and fired upon by the arrows and the extensions of the Almighty. That's all the time we have for right now. We'll continue this sometime soon. I'll see you then. Take care until then. So glad to see you now. Bye-bye.